Okay. So, hello everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Business Breaks podcast, where we delve into the fascinating world of manufacturing and reshoring with a distinguished guest, Harry Moser, a trailblazer in American manufacturing, and as the former North American president and chairman emeritus of GF Machining Solutions and the founder of the ReShoring Initiative, Harry has dedicated his career to bringing manufacturing jobs back to the US. His remarkable efforts have earned him a place in the Industry Week Manufacturing Hall of Fame, as well as the title of Quality Magazine's Quality Professional of the Year for 2012. Now, Harry's impact extends beyond the industry. He's been a key participant in high-level discussions, including President Obama's 2012 Insourcing Forum at the White House, and is a recognized voice in major publications and national media. And with an impressive educational background, including a master's in engineering, as well as an MBA, Harry combines academic excellence with real-world experience and impact. So today, Harry continues to drive change through the ReShoring Initiative, focused on enhancing US competitiveness and strengthening the skilled workforce. So join us as we delve into his insights on reshaping American manufacturing and his vision for the future of the industry. Harry, welcome to Business Breaks.
Dante, it's great to be here. Excellent introduction. I have to live up to that.
I'm sure you will. I mean, your CV speaks for itself. Your resume. So to kick things off, Harry, can I ask you, what is reshoring and what are the current trends?
Okay. So we actually track two trends. One is reshoring. The other is FDI, foreign direct investment. So reshoring is a U.S. headquartered company producing a product in the U.S. to fill a market segment that for a while had been filled from offshore. Now, it might have shut down a factory offshore. It might not. It might be company A producing something to take market share from company B, which was importing it, still reshoring. Okay, but it's a U.S. headquartered company. Whereas FDI, foreign direct investment, that's very easy. Any foreign headquartered company, think Siemens, Toyota, any Honda, that hires here, builds a new factory, hires a bunch of people, then that's foreign direct investment. That's very easy to track. So, but both of those trends follow the same logic. In both cases, the company has decided that it would rather supply the U.S. with U.S. production rather than production somewhere significantly distant. We track both in-house, in other words, a GM factory, a Toyota factory, what have you, but also outsourced, because the supply chain typically has more people in it, more jobs in it, more investment than the assembly plant. So if you look at an automotive assembly plant, it's sort of the top of a bill of materials pyramid, and there might be 1,000, 2,000 people at the assembly plant, but there's probably 5,000 or 10,000 people making the axles and the steel and the everything else that goes up into that final assembly. So we track both, and very important to note that it's the domestic production replacing foreign production. Doesn't have to be the same company. It doesn't even have to be the same product. I mean, in theory, you could say that if we'd done this 120 years ago, that when the car was introduced, it might have been replacing buggies that were being imported. Okay. Just to show you the trend in this, we pull up the first slide. Okay. So I founded the organization in 2010, and in that year, we identified 6,000 jobs of reshoring plus FDI. And the trend did very nicely, getting up there into tens of thousands, eventually 100,000 plus. Peaked in 2017 with the the Trump tax and regulatory cuts created a lot of business enthusiasm to bring jobs back. Fell off with the trade wars. The companies didn't know what to do, didn't know what the rules were going to be, so they said, let's wait and see what happens. And then picked up with COVID and continued to rise since then with geopolitical uncertainty and other concerns, and so that it hit a new record last year, 2022, of 350,000. So this isn't cumulative. This is each of these numbers is an annual event for the year, and so it's gone from 6,000 to 350,000 a year in 12 or 13 years. We think it's done dramatically more than I thought it would do in this time period, and everybody else thought it would do less than I did.
Wow. And it tells such an amazing story, really. And I'm sure there's nuances, because it seems like that probably companies that were already based in the US benefited from that increase in demand for products and services. And
of course, that supply chain, in many ways, like if you get say an automotive company and they build a new assembly factory, or GM, something like that,
mm-hmm.
and they have to be convinced that doing it here instead of Mexico, or instead of somewhere else in the world, that even with our higher wage rates, regulations, taxes, et cetera, that they're going to make up for the higher wage costs in other ways: less inventory, quicker delivery, better engineering, manufacturing coordination, things like that. Whereas the supply chain companies, the people who make the steel and the castings and the machine parts and the plastic parts, for them, this is all new business. I mean, this is, they don't get GM, et cetera, holds them pretty tight, but nevertheless, for them, they could get a 20, 30, 50% increase in volume by becoming the supplier to that new factory. So in many ways, the benefits are greater for the supply chain, for the SMEs, small to medium-sized companies, than they are for the OEM. And so those small to medium-sized companies are very enthusiastic on how to participate, whereas the OEMs, it's a challenge to get their attention and convince them to do it, because they've got to decide. Let's say they're already assembling here and they're bringing in castings, and someone has to convince them to be willing to pay 20, 30% more for the castings. But by convincing them that, well, you won't have duty and you won't have freight and you won't have perhaps the Trump tariffs, and you're confident you can get the delivery despite port strikes and wars and whatever else might be happening. So it takes a certain leap of faith for the OEM to make the decision, whereas the company that gets the order for those components, for them, it's sure, delighted.
Absolutely. And it's such an interesting business conundrum to face, especially for leaders who have to make those calls and balance the trade-offs. So I guess to that extent, what is the mission of the ReShoring Initiative?
Yeah, it's very simple. It's to balance the goods trade deficit. So the trade deficit is the difference between how much we export and how much we import. And last year, 2022, that deficit was $1.2 trillion just in goods, $1.2 trillion, and that amounts to roughly 6 million manufacturing jobs. So our trade deficit has cost us a deficit of about 6 million manufacturing jobs. So when we overcome that, when we achieve our mission, the U.S. manufacturing will be 40% larger than it is now, 6 million more jobs, assuming current levels of productivity. So it's obviously a big challenge, a big goal.
Is it feasible, would you say, Harry?
Yeah, let's say it's feasible to make a lot of progress. And I guess everything depends on the time frame. If you said in next year, no, very easy. If you said in the next 50 years, and why would you take 50 years? Because the trade deficit started around 1979, so it's taken 45 years to get to where we've gotten to. Okay? And so it would be reasonable to expect it's going to take 30, 40, 50 years to recover, assuming we do a really good job of recovering. So another way of looking at it is that certainly it's going to take a lot of effort. If we continue to do things exactly as we've done them, it will not happen. Just like, for example, if you ask me, can you run a 6-minute mile?
Could I even run a mile right now?
Okay.
If
I say, can you run a 6-minute mile? You'd say right now, no.
No, exactly.
But I'd say if you trained hard, like 5 days a week for a year or 2 years, then you probably could run a 6-minute mile. And just the same way the U.S. has to train hard, it has to do a much better job of getting its students to go into apprenticeships, to become tool makers and welders and precision machinists, and not so many to become sociologists and anthropologists and history majors and so on. Right? And to be more like the Germans in that sense. And we would also say to get the dollar down, it's generally agreed the dollar is 20 to 30% overvalued because we're the reserve currency. And that automatically creates a huge price difference in our goods. And so, but if we can get the dollar down by 20 or 30%, that plus having a really good skilled workforce, higher productivity, enough capacity, et cetera. If I could have those today, and then I'd say yes, in 5 years we can make it happen. So another way of looking at this, a lot of economists would say that a developed nation should do services, software, technology, things like that, and let those low-wage countries do the manufacturing. But if you look at this map, the darker colors have the highest percentages of their workforce in manufacturing. And if you can quite see into Europe, most of the European countries, which have wages similar to ours, are darker than we are. Mexico is darker than we are. Japan, South Korea, definitely are much higher percentages in, like France is. We think of French as drinking wine and smoking cigarettes or something, but they've got a higher percentage of their people doing manufacturing than we do. So is it feasible? Yes. These other countries that have similar economic structures as we do have proven that it's feasible. But it's going to take action, and it's going to take decades.
Understand. No, that's fascinating. And yeah, it is a long-term game. But yeah, it's good to think about how you can plan for it and ensure the futures of the next generation of workers, because it would be good to.
Yeah, pull up the next slide if you would. And that's interesting. It's interesting. The line, see the line that's up there, the straight line that's up in the blue area is supposed to come all the way through down, and it didn't for some reason. But what I did, I took the years from when China joined the WTO until we had the Great Recession, did a regression line through that. That's that straight line you can see starting up there. And if that continued at that pace, we would today have about 6 million fewer jobs than we actually do in manufacturing. So our conclusion is that during that rapid decline in that previous 10, 15 years, the U.S. was offshoring rapidly, losing lots of jobs to China, Asia, various places, and reshoring almost nothing. And now we've reversed that. We're offshoring very little, and we're reshoring and FDIing a lot. And therefore, the red dots show how manufacturing has continuously, not rapidly, but rather continuously increased number of manufacturing jobs for the last 10, 12 years. And if you go back and look at our 100-year history, it's almost never had that long a period of gradual, continuous increase. So it's happening. Is it feasible? Well, it's happening, which is a good indication of feasibility.
Yeah, and it certainly tells a story about being able to be self-sufficient as well as a country, because as you mentioned, with geopolitical issues, rising fuel costs, fossil fuels, that obviously adds costs onto your supply chain as well as the disruptions. So It's not just a business issue, but it's also an economic one on a international level. So I think that's fascinating, and I dare say you have a few interesting stories of examples of companies that have reversed the trend and contributed to that kind of uptick in jobs in the US. Do you have
Sure.
any interesting stories?
Of course, the way you help people understand is to tell stories, huh? And the original, sort of the seminal story that came out maybe 12 years ago was GE Appliances in Louisville, and they had been having many of their appliances. The GE Louisville factory, heavily unionized, had declined, number of employees coming down, not much investment, having many of their appliances made in China and imported. And then an article came out in The Atlantic, unusual place for a manufacturing story, but excellent article, probably the best I've ever seen. And this fellow went down, analyzed what had happened, and at GE they said it makes sense to bring the work back, and they took the appliances and they did something like DFMA, design for manufacturability and assembly. So they analyzed and found ways that maybe there were 4 pieces that were being, let's say, welded or screwed together. Instead, they made 1 piece, and so you had less labor to put the thing together. And they completely redesigned many of the products, and as a result, even with their higher wage rates here in the U.S. at the time, probably 5 times China, they were able to get the manufacturing down close enough that when they considered the duty and the freight and all that other stuff that was involved, it was a no-brainer to bring it back. And about a year ago, the current GE appliance CEO, and I think he may have been back then, I'm not sure, but he came out and said, folks, all that work that went offshore, well, most of it didn't make any sense even at the time. If you'd done the math correctly, you would have kept the work here, and we've brought it back, and we're going to keep bringing it back. So they're an excellent example. Big company. Smaller companies. One that won the National Metalworking Reshoring Award this year, which was announced at Fab Tech, big trade show in McCormick Place back in September. And the company was Hobson and Moser, which is in Connecticut. The big company, hundreds of employees, very precision machining, and they got an order for a medical device component, something that goes into the assembly of a medical device, and it required just the absolute extreme of metal forming, machining, assembly. It had to be perfect, and the head, I think it was being done by a Korean company, and the Connecticut company Hobson Moser proved that they did a better job. And one reason they're that way, they invest. I can't remember. I think 5 to 10% of their annual revenue into new equipment every year. So substantial investment in quality and productivity, and they have, I think, 4 or 5 different apprentice programs within the company. So they're getting the smartest high school kids and training them really well and giving them the best equipment, and they're doing what you should do to win, and they won. So I'm very proud of them. Another interesting case happens to also be Connecticut. Connecticut or Massachusetts, I'm not sure which. New England Dye Company, Nedco, and they're a customer of one of our sponsors called United Grinding. Makes fancy CNC grinding machines, and Nedco had been producing a variety of carbide tools and objects manually and grinding them. Your skill had 3 people doing this very skilled work, also some EDM involved in it. And then they bought a Studer, part of United Grinding, a CNC machine, and they found now that they could make the same pieces with 80% fewer man hours per piece. So all of a sudden their costs were competitive with China, or wherever else he could have gone. And their quality, where they occasionally human made a mistake before, they haven't had one piece of scrap since they put this machine in. See? And they found that it's good both for single volume, which is generally sort of tough to do on CNC, and also for high volume. And so they've had significant volumes of both. And something, I can't remember now, but something like 60 or 70% of their total annual revenue is product that's been reshored.
Wow.
So it really, it's not a big shop, but it's still a very dramatic, story. And the guy who owns it runs the machine. He's got other people there, but he makes sure it gets done right. So three, I think, so a really big company, a sort of middle-sized company, and then a small company, all very successful.
That's amazing. And thank you for sharing those very inspiring examples. So it's clear that there's this incentive to reshore, and it seems to drive innovation in order to remain competitive, to offset the higher labor costs by keeping work at home. But why else do companies reshore?
Well, I break it down into two time periods from say 2010 when we started analyzing until about 2019, so just before the COVID. It was a broad range of costs and risks. I think of it as the death of 1,000 cuts. So there's an interesting story. A professor, John Gray at The Ohio State University Business School, he found 4 small to medium-sized companies that had offshored and then reshored. And he did a case study on them like professors do, and said, why did you offshore? Well, the wages were so much lower and the prices were so much lower that I had to do it. It was obvious. Huh? Well, then why'd you reshore? And they said, well, over a couple of year period, quality issues, travel, late night communications, late delivery, lost orders because I didn't have the parts that I needed, too much inventory, whatever. You put all that together, and any one of those probably wouldn't have driven it, but the sum of all those irritations and problems was enough to convince us to bring it back. So that was 2010 to 2019. And then from 2020 to 2023, it's seeing bigger issues like COVID. Obviously, product maybe came over a month late or 2 months late with remember the boats outside of LA and all those problems. So people got used to it. Say they experienced a 1 month, a 2 month delivery, and then we had Russia, Ukraine, and now we've got the Middle East, and hanging over it all is China, Taiwan, because China and that general area of the world is a major source of so much of what we import. So it turns out that a recent survey by Chief Executive Magazine asked companies, what motivates you to reshore? And the number one issue they said was geopolitical risk. So the risk that there will be decoupling or de-risking, which will prevent them for an extended period of time, 3 months, 6 months, a year, forever, from getting product from that other country. Okay. So we, a couple months ago, came out with a geopolitical risk map, which shows the probability of that happening with any given country. I think there's 7 countries, maybe 8 continents, or something like that on there. And we said the U.S. it's essentially 0. We said Russia's 100 because you're not supposed to buy anything from Russia now. And we tried to be very moderate with China and said 3.5%. We got the data from a survey of geopoliticians about what's the probability of war over Taiwan. Okay, and so we spread this out for all, and so the idea is that like for any of our listeners, if they've got something they're bringing in from offshore, whether you're a retailer or you're a manufacturer, especially if you're a manufacturer, bring in components, and especially if it's from one of these higher risk areas like the Middle East or especially China, you say to yourself, well, what's the probability that we're going to get cut off? Well, for China, we'd say 3.5% per year, so which means over 10 years, 35%. And then if that happens, how much business will I lose? If I don't have these components, how long is it going to take me to replace them, given that everybody else in the country will not have the components they need? They'll all be going to the same suppliers to get stuff and the suppliers are already busy. So it's going to be years till they get resupplied. So how much sales am I going to lose? How much margin am I going to lose? Times the probability of it happening, and compare that to the incremental cost of getting it here, or maybe Germany, but somewhere safe, or Canada, and compare those two numbers and be able to see which components make the sense to bring it back now. So what I always tell them, bring it back now, bring as much as you can justify back now, strengthen your local supply base here in the United States. So if this does happen, you can call them up and say, hey, Bill, all the work I've given you the last 2 years, I need a favor. There's a war over there. I need some more parts, and I need them fast. Whereas if you haven't done that, if you get nothing from anybody, then you call them up and say, hey, I need parts. They say, you're the 100th call I've had today after the war started. I think I can carry you in about 5 years. Anyway, so we think there's a real role here. The other thing that's happening that's interesting is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And the environmental is fairly easy to track. We have a software called the TCO estimator that companies can use to calculate all these other costs and risks that we're talking about, values of various kinds. And in it, we have 9 different product categories: steel, aluminum die casting, apparel, paper. And the system calculates the environmental impact of making it in that other country and shipping it here versus making it here. And for example, relative to China, making it here instead of there and shipping it here cuts the emissions by 25 to 50%. So if a company is saying, what can we do to meet our environmental goals? Well, I could put up solar panels. Well, it's okay, put up solar panels. But you can save a lot more by sourcing your product here where it doesn't have to be shipped, and even more so where the electricity used in the production of the product is made primarily with sources other than coal, whereas in China, something like 70% of it's made with coal, and therefore every kilowatt hour difference means less emissions by making it here. So we believe that ESG is very important. And in fact, a recent survey showed that companies are starting to recognize that reshoring is the single fastest way for them to reduce their environmental load.
Amazing. And yeah, I can imagine not having to move parts back and forth, and even subcomponent parts, because they could, as well as raw materials, it just improves everything. And that's a great story. I guess sounds really great, but surely there are obviously challenges in implementing a reshoring strategy. What are the biggest considerations?
If there weren't challenges, they wouldn't need me. I would have a job. Anyway,
absolutely.
So skilled workforce. Workforce in general, I mean, even low skill even is very hard to get, and high skill is especially hard to get, and can take years to train. So skilled workforce availability and skill level. So if you take the U.S., too often the worker falls into manufacturing and as a job, and they get some training and they do okay. Okay. Whereas in, say, Germany or Switzerland or Austria, Japan, many of the very smart kids in high school, very aggressive kids, go into manufacturing, go into a 4-year apprenticeship program, get exceptionally good training, and so when they come out, they're probably as good at the end of 4 years as our 20-year veteran is, or they're better because they've really studied the basics. And so you get over there, you have more of them, and you get on the average smarter ones on average, and they train them a lot better, and we tend to just sort of make do, and so skilled workforce availability and skill level, as a result of all these various things, our manufacturing cost is about 10 to 40% higher here, like 10% higher than Germany and 40% higher than China. India, so on, and therefore companies look at that and they say, "Wow, I get 40%. I get fired if I don't go there. And so that's a huge difference. It has to be overcome. And unfortunately, the companies tend to look just at that price difference, with the FOB or free on board or ex works price, the factory price, the manufacturing cost, rather than including the duty and the freight and the carrying cost of inventory and the risk of stocking out, and risk of war, all this kind of stuff. And so that's hard. We did a survey with Plant Moran, one of the big consulting companies, asked companies, manufacturers, and distributors, why do you offshore? Why don't you get it here? And they said, price. Overwhelmingly. So price is the big thing. Our tax system isn't very good. We cut the nominal tax rate, but when we did that in 2017, we also had accelerated depreciation. You could write off capital investment in new productive equipment in the year in which you installed it, where now that's phasing out. And so by, I think, 4 years from now, we'll be back to depreciating in over 7 years or something like that. And that's not much of an incentive to invest. U.S. companies tend to have a short-term perspective. The big companies want to make quarterly earnings. The smaller company wants enough money left to buy a new Cadillac or Mercedes or something. Yeah. And whereas the Europeans, even when things are slow, they buy equipment. They hire apprentices. They train them. They're continually investing, and we need to do a better job of that. So all those things influence us. So it's not a slam dunk. It requires behavioral changes at the federal level and the state level, like training, getting the dollar down by 20 or 30%. There's methodologies like the market access charge to do that, and then just longer term perspective by the companies.
Yeah, and you mentioned quite rightly about the short term perspective, and even it sounds like when you're doing the cost analysis, you're basing it on incomplete information when you're not baking in the freight, shipping, and related import taxes on that. So it's a fascinating challenge, and obviously sounds like it's almost like you're doing a correction after finding out it's not working, or at least not working as well as you'd hoped.
For the country, it certainly hasn't worked well, and for the companies, they've survived. Many of them survived. Of course, there's tens of thousands of small manufacturing companies that didn't survive because the big companies bought the stuff offshore instead of getting them here.
Yeah, and obviously that's a big factor. When big companies move, they tend to take the economic activity with them in terms of the related services, as well as small pot suppliers. I think, coming back to that strategic vision, what are the potential long-term benefits of reshoring for the company's growth and sustainability? Are there any considerations that affect the decision for a lot of these businesses?
Yeah, I'd say, why don't you pull up the next slide, slide number 5. Yeah, so this is a very interesting slide. The lady who founded and runs ReSolink developed this, and she says that companies have gone from the before to the after, and the before is the green and the after is the red. So the before, let's say up until a couple of years ago, companies were, when they decided where to get components, where to buy stuff, they said, how do I save pennies on that? Can I save a few more pennies by going somewhere else, kind of thing? Huh? And now they're concerned, the red, that they have the products so they can assemble their end product and ship it and make tens of thousands of dollars worth of profit on shipping the end product, which they cannot do if they don't have the components to make it. So they've gone from worrying about pennies to protecting tens of thousands, okay? which fits exactly into our thought process. So this ReSolink, they're an expert on this subject, and I recommend them as a source for information. So that's an important benefit for companies, that if you don't have the components, you can't sell your product. Lower inventory, like one company that I dealt with, Mori Corp, is a printed circuit board manufacturer outside Chicago. and they had been buying an aluminum die casting from China, and something they had a quality issue. I'm thinking it leaked. There's a housing that the circuit boards went in, and water and electricity don't do well together, and so their customer was furious, insisted they find a domestic source. They got a domestic source for the housing. And first, they solved the quality problem. That was most important. But second, a year later, when they went back and checked, their inventory of the component was down by 94%. And they still had all they need. Why? Because instead of getting a mountain of the product once every quarter to fill a container, they got just what they need once a week from their local supplier. Instead of keeping extra there in case there was a quality issue, they didn't have to keep extra there. And so we'd say a general thought would be 50% reduction in inventory. And there's a lot of companies out there that have given up on just-in-time, JIT, because you can't assure that you can have the product arriving in the time that you want. And yeah, that's true if you're trying to get it from halfway across the world. But if you're getting it from somebody 10 or 50 or 100 miles away, such that if you're about to run out, they can get in the pickup truck and bring you 10 of them, to keep going, now you've got a solution. So if you want to keep doing just in time, local makes sense. The ability of engineering and manufacturing to optimize because they can speak the same language in the same time zone, actually physically get together, share a coffee, look at the problem, work it out. That's good. I think many companies have problems with the workforce, obviously recruitment, retention, and so on. And one of the best things they can do is show their commitment to the workforce and the community by first hiring and training and then retaining, not shutting down and moving the work off to somewhere else, but showing the community that they're committed to the community, committed to the workforce by increasing the work here, bringing work back instead of shipping it off somewhere else. I mentioned ESG. So all these things are positive impacts for the company, but also for the community and the country.
I can imagine it must do wonders for the brand to have made in USA products and services.
That's generally true. The only problem is, especially with consumer goods, in consumer goods is where it's probably should have the biggest difference. Surveys say that, 70% of people would rather buy made in U.S. and 30 or 40% are willing to pay 10% or more premium for it. But when you go to the store and you look for the made in USA product, you don't find any, you see?
Oh my God, yeah.
Okay, so if anybody out there is a retailer and agrees with that thought, we have a plan on how to overcome that issue. So if anybody wants it, and if Dante gives you our contact information, I'd be delighted to have someone that wants to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll definitely include your contact details in the show notes, Harry. This is a fascinating conversation. And just to kind of go back a couple of sentences and points, I've seen enough supply chain managers saying we're moving from just in time to just in case. So, that's probably symptomatic of not having a localized supply chain.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I was on an annual conference of AMA, Association for Manufacturing Excellence, which is the Lean Association. This is about 2 or 3 years ago. And someone said, "Is just-in-time history? Have companies gotten too lean and with just-in-time?" I said, and everybody else said, "Yeah." I said, no. The companies haven't gotten lean enough, because if they'd been lean enough, they would have understood all the waste associated with offshoring, and they would have had local sources, and just-in-time would still be very easy to do.
Yeah. And it's so much easier to control the quality if you're able to just hop on a car, drive a mile down to visit your supplier versus flying all the way across the world to actually see them. And the same with, shall we say, poor quality parts. If you've shipped them all the way and, like, say 5% is faulty, you end up just scrapping in location rather than sending them back and getting them fixed.
Of course,
which is waste.
Yeah. Or they go out and they're and you have a warranty issue, which is even worse.
Yeah.
It's like just on that subject. I talked to someone who's like a salesman for a shop, and And he said, Harry, I got a problem. I'm trying to convince this big company to buy from us. And I go in and I see the purchasing person and I say, hey, why don't you buy from us? And the purchasing person says, you'd have to match the Chinese price. And the salesman says, I've heard that you're having warranty issues and you got too much inventory or you don't have enough. And that's costing you all kinds of money. And can't we put that into the calculation, total cost of ownership? And the purchasing person says, those are not in my budget. Those are in somebody else's budget. I buy just based on price. That's not a team player. So you have to find a way to get around them, get to the general manager, get to the other departments that are being impacted, and get them to convince the purchasing department to consider their needs as well as the needs of the purchasing department.
That's a mic drop moment there, and it brings back a painful memory as an accountant. I now work as an IT project manager, but back in the day, we had shipping costs, and I spoke to a global director of purchasing about the same thing. We were losing a lot of money on import duties on subcomponents parts because of a legal technicality, which meant we couldn't reclaim our import taxes that were onward processed. And, when I tried to explain it to him as a kind of, it was all tied to tax legislation in that jurisdiction. And he just said, well, when you say the word taxes, I'm going to fall asleep. So you might as well get lost, So again, coming back to a flawed metric and the wrong behaviors, not thinking holistically, because it's not in your performance targets.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Brilliant. So I guess, what does the ReShoring Initiative do to accelerate reshoring?
We think of it in four steps, so to speak. First, we document the trend. We're the only source of data on how much is being reshored, how many jobs, how much investment, from what countries to what states, for what reasons, what industries, what products, all that kind of thing. We're the go-to place for that. So we document. And one reason we document it is that I have a survey someone else did. It said company B is more likely to reshore if it sees that company A has done it. So by making it very visible, by people listening to your podcast, they'll be a little more likely to reshore than if they hadn't listened to the podcast. So that's why I'm here. So we document, we promote. So we write maybe 2 or 3 articles a month. We get quoted in 3 or 4 or 5 interviews a month. We do 60, 70 events like this a year, live, in the field or remote. So we do everything we can to get. I talk to people at parties. You get to listen. So we promote. We enable. We have the TCO estimator. So if you pull up slide 6.
Sure.
Okay. So the horizontal axis is the China FOB price as a percentage of the U.S. FOB price. So the vertical line is 100. So at 100, they're equal. To the left, China is cheaper. To the right, U.S. is cheaper. And this is 190 cases of people using our TCO estimator that had done that analysis. And you can see in the blue line, which is the price, the peak is around 75%. And with the TCO line, which then includes duty and freight and carrying cost of inventory, but not China risk, none of those new big things. The red line shifts to the peaks around 85. And if there's a 15% Trump tariff in, then it shifts to the yellow line, so the peaks around 100. And so if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the area under the curve for the blue line to the right of the horizontal of the vertical line. So 8% of the cases, based on price, the U.S. wins. Based on total cost, 32%, and total cost with the tariff, 46%. So just by getting the companies to do the math correctly, you can add 20 or 30% of what's being imported to the logical to make in the United States category, just in the interest of the company, not considering the interest of the country. and your fellow citizens and your neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. So TCO, very important. We have a new version coming out that will include ESG, so the emissions impact, et cetera. Will include the Section 301 tariffs, like I show here, and will include the geopolitical risks. So we made that map so that people could use it when they're doing the analysis and have numbers to input into the equation to figure out what that prospective loss is or expected value loss is of something like decoupling. So we also have a program where a company can put up a product of some kind, something they make and they're really good at, and we can tell them who the biggest importers of those products are, and then train them to use our TCO estimator to convince the importer to buy from the manufacturer instead. So import substitution. We're about to come out with a website, a page on our website that lists all or most of the federal grant opportunities, all these things that came out with the CHIPS Act and the IRA, et cetera. So depending on what industry you're in and whether you're like an OEM or a supplier, and et cetera, it'll target you at whom to call in Washington to ask for money. I'm not guaranteeing that anybody in particular will get it, but at least if you think that maybe you deserve it because what you're doing is green or it helps some of these key programs, this will help you be efficient about finding the best solutions for that. So we document, we promote, we enable, and then we advocate. So we're continually trying to get the government to spend more on or emphasize more on apprentice programs, to reduce the dollar, to have the corporate tax rates more efficient in terms of investment and so on. So if we put all those things together, that's what we do.
I have a confession to make, and this is why this show is so relevant. I'm based in the UK, but 95% of my podcast audience are in the USA. So this is really interesting. What would, if a business owner in America was listening to this, how would they be able to gain access to this sort of service and guidance?
Well, most of the kind of data and the things that I'm describing are on our website at reshorenow.org.
Mm.
Okay. We're the ReShoring Initiative, but the website is reshorenow.org. And you can go there and you can find charts like this and mentions of the various programs that we provide. This TCO estimator is free there to use online. You have to sign up, sign in, use it. Mm-hmm. And if they want to, they can email me. It's harry.moser, M-O-S-E-R, at reshorenow.org. So if you've got a question, first, if you need help deciding to reshore, love to help you. If you've succeeded in reshoring, then tell us what it is, and we can add it to our database of the reshoring. And maybe if it's metallic, then you could apply for the National Metalworking Reshoring Award, and I can give you the prize in September of 2024 at IMTS, the 100,000 plus person machine tool show.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, thank you. And do you come across any, when you're executing this reshoring strategy, I take it like in terms of feasibility, you must encounter unique challenges to different types of business. And one thing I had in mind is, say, for example, you have a key supplier and for whatever reason, they're not willing to relocate to the US. Do you end up having to redesign your supply chain in order to maintain your operations? Is that something that comes up as a challenge?
There certainly are some products in which the U.S. is not self-sufficient, like rare earth minerals, like solar cells, like EV batteries. The most sophisticated chips, all these kinds of things, the U.S. has been relatively out of. We weren't making anymore, or making just maybe experimental quantities, not production. So So now the government's done a lot with the chips and the EV batteries. It's amazing what hundreds of billions of dollars will get you. and but there's still certainly other categories where not. And then you either have to convince the supplier to come over here and build a factory, or you have to find someone who makes something similar and convince them to say, hey, I need $5 million a year worth of these things. How about like one thing we've tried, have not succeeded yet. I've had three or four companies come to me and say they need big castings, iron castings, like 1,000 pounds each, bases for machines. And they all say they've gone to all the foundries, and the foundries say they're either too busy, or for $1 million or $2 million a year, they're not willing to expand. Okay, and so what I'd like to do, and I haven't had time, is to gather 5 of those companies together, so they've got $10 million a year worth of business, and then go to the foundry and say, okay, who wants $10 million a year worth of business? And these companies are willing to put up a guarantee, annual minimum quantity, something like that, so that the foundry can go ahead and spend 20 million or whatever to build the capacity to make the castings, so the work can come back. So there's, if you just sit here and wait for it to happen, it's not going to happen. Somebody's got to go out and do the hard work of putting the pieces together to make the puzzle and make it happen.
Interesting. And I guess there's the business challenge, but there's also government who have a vested interest in ensuring that the economy is resilient. What do you think the government should do to accelerate reshoring?
Yeah, as I've mentioned all along, the massively shift resources from college degrees to apprenticeships. And I don't mean fewer engineers. I mean fewer anthropologists, sociologists, the kind of people, fewer people winding up working at Starbucks to pay off their university degree.
Yeah.
And so that's number one, because you need it both you need millions of people to have the capacity, and you need better productivity by having better trained people. Reduce the dollar by 20 or 30%. Fix the tax system, like I talked about with the depreciation rate. Maybe a value-added tax. There's pluses and minuses to it, but almost all the other countries have a value-added tax, maybe 15% tax on imports and a 15% credit on exports, and we don't do either. So we're, falling behind on that competitiveness feature. So those are and then there's a list of a dozen other things. But I believe, like some people would say, investment or innovation, and those are necessary. But I believe companies will only invest here if they believe that they'll get a good return on their investment here. And until you have the workforce and you get the currency to the proper level so that you will be profitable here, people aren't going to invest enough to make a big difference. Okay, so I think you have to. We say the government should be should be leveling the playing field, so then allow the market to make the decisions of what will be made here. But right now, the price difference is so much that it's very hard to justify most things coming back. Whereas if you get that difference down to here, now an investment in really good equipment and people and so on can get the U.S. cost down to here and still get a good return on the investment.
That's interesting. And yeah, a lot of those incentives are actually financial in nature, but I'm sure there's other ways to actually encourage companies to reshore, either through regulations, enhancing standards as well, to ensure that companies or countries that are just competing on price are actually having a basis for a comparison. And then if they have to increase the quality, then they have to price it into their service, or else it's just, dumping cheap goods that could be substandard. I mean, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case, but I guess having transparency around, there's value and then there's cost, and the cost seems to be one side of the equation that's not always even fully understood, even though in theory, as a business person, that should be the easiest thing to quantify. So I guess coming back to a point of yours about environment and ESG. So what sort of environmental and safety standards would you find need to be adhered to and how would a company prepare for that as they prepare to onshore or reshore previously offshored operations?
One thing that relates to that, there's a lot of discussion about and plans for tariffs that would be based on the environmental load of the product that's being imported. So if the casting made in the other country, if making it produces more emissions than making it here, then you'd charge them an extra tariff to make up for that, so as to encourage the work to be done in the lower emissions place. And the U.S. isn't always the lower emissions. For example, Canada is close, close as most states, and most of their electricity is hydro, and therefore their emissions per kilowatt hour are lower than ours. So you might want to move some work from the U.S. to Canada. That's okay. But overall, you'll move much more work from China to the U.S. than you will from the U.S. to Canada, kind of thing. So many conservatives resist the ESG movement, and yet they won't work to come to the U.S. And one of the best ways to do it is to make sure that government and companies are cognizant of and adjust for the ESG considerations.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And you mentioned TCO, and I think that's part of the equation. If you can price in the environmental considerations and factors, then it becomes more of a holistic decision rather than just saying, well, we've got this limited scope of cost which we can quantify, and on that basis it makes sense to stay offshored. But really, when you think about the whole impact, and as you mentioned, I haven't even covered what are the benefits of having locations with full employment. That's kind of that is really fascinating.
So our revised TCO estimator, which I'm supposed to be working on, will quantify those environmental differences, will quantify the value of a job brought to the United States, and then give the company the chance to say, yeah, I care. That should go into our value, or they can say, I don't care. But at least it challenges them to make the responsible decision.
Absolutely. Thank you, Harry. And in terms of the skills gap, do you see that reshoring might increase that concern in the US, where there's potentially a skills shortage for certain skilled labor in the economy?
Well, there already are shortages, clearly, and all the old people like my age, they ought to be working instead of sitting on the beach, and then we wouldn't have a problem. but it cuts two ways. As we bring jobs back, that's more demand, and if the supply doesn't go up, then there's more shortage. So that's clear. On the other hand, if you look at why students have not chosen to go into manufacturing, one of the reasons was the belief that manufacturing is disappearing in the United States, that all the work's being offshored to China, India, Mexico, somewhere else. So why would I want to become an apprentice, spend 4 years learning something, and then not be able to get a job when I come out of the apprentice, right? So to the extent that the society sees that manufacturing coming back is not just a possibility, but that it's a reality. Yeah. So the worker can say, yeah, I'm going to get, like the guidance counselor can say, Susie, yeah, you want to become a welder? Become a welder. It's a great career. Make $100,000 a year with overtime. In fact, someone keeps telling me that the underwater welders get $150,000 to $200,000 a year.
I can well believe that. And, it's like the skilled manual labor. That's going to be something that wouldn't necessarily be replaced through automation. And with the advent of AI being what it is, you can see a lot of white collar jobs disappearing even now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the AI, I think, works better on information than it does on things.
Yeah.
So you're
Exactly.
probably more protected if you're a welder or you're something else, because there's going to be even in the recessions, people are still looking for welders.
Yeah. I mean, my plumber, he comes to me for advice on how to update his website. So it's just nuts. But I think you'd be making more if you just paid someone to do your website for you. But I think for him, it's similar to me. It's a hobby. But yeah, I think it's interesting what AI can do these days. Just to go off on an adjacent tangent, but thank you, Harry. I guess to wrap up, what are your views on the future of reshoring?
It looks like 2023 will be flat with 2022. Definitely, the surge is not continuing, and we believe that's because the government's running out of hundreds of billions of dollars to give away, and the deficit and debt have gotten so big that they can't keep piling more on. I think that the big companies have big projects going already, and they cannot find enough construction workers and then enough factory workers. So I think they got enough to digest, like the pythons that just swallowed the pig. Has to digest for a while, and there is a shortage. So I'll be delighted if things will just sort of coast along at 300,000 or so jobs a year being brought back, and then because I hear all the time from people who say, Harry, I've been told by management to bring the work back or to evaluate what to bring back. And so I know there's tens of thousands of companies that are planning it. All the surveys say that 80 or 90% of companies are planning to do it. So it's just time for them to get that in gear. The government can help if it will work on the workforce issues and get the dollar down. And then it'll be more obvious. They won't need me to sharpen the pencil to convince them to do it. We should get it to the point where it's obvious.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the key to that acceleration is lower US dollar.
Lower US dollar and more skilled workforce.
Brilliant. So, Harry, that interview flew by. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. Just one final question. If any of our listeners want to connect with you, where's the best place online to do that?
Well, the website is reshorenow.org, and I'm at harry.moser@reshorenow.org. And you can email me, you can leave a note on the website, you can do whatever, and I'd love to hear about your reshoring successes and help you have more reshoring successes in the future. So we're here for you.
Brilliant. And listeners, if you're interested in reshoring, I will drop Harry's details in the show notes. Harry, thank you for an amazing conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Bye, Dante.
Thank you. Bye.
Business Breaks